So what is the origin of the measles virus? The human measles virus. Has it always been a human measles virus? Have humans always been infected by this particular virus? Where did it originate from? Now, I just talked a week ago about a child who had an active case of measles that visited Noah's Ark. Not the Noah's Ark, but the Noah's Ark theme park in Kentucky. But that stimulated someone who watched that video to ask a question in the comments that I thought was worthy of following up and pursuing a little bit. And here's that comment. Speaking of measles on the Ark, could measles have survived for a year given the number of available hosts and the amount of time it can spend in each one? Oh, by the way, when it says, when speaking of the Ark, in this case, actually speaking of the Noah's Ark, all right? So, what about where did the measles, this is essentially a question of the origin of the measles virus. In a best case scenario, how zoonotic is it? And we'll talk about zoonotic origins in a moment. And how many individual hosts would it need? This is a question of, if we assume that this is a human virus and that's been passed down by humans, and there was a global flood and Noah and his family, or 8 total people, survived this flood incident and then repopulated the entire world, how did the measles virus survive the trip? Because remember, all viruses have to persist by continuing to infect new hosts because that host is making new copies for them. So how could they have made it through the Ark bottleneck, come out the other side, and then continue to persist and infect human beings? So we need to examine, what do young Earth creationists, because Noah's Ark, a global flood just 4,350 years ago, is a young Earth creationist worldview of human history. And we need to ask the question, what do young Earth creationists think about the origin of viruses, the persistence of viruses, and where something like human diseases come from? So we're going to be able to discuss all those things because of this comment made on my recent video. Let's get cracking. All right, so here's our questions, right? We'll try to address. What is a virus kind? Right, as you can see here, young Earth creationists believe that Noah's Ark contained representatives of kinds of created beings, like canines and felines and equines. What about viral kinds? Was there one kind of virus that God created that then became all other viruses? Or maybe God created many different kinds, all right, types of viruses, which then have proliferated and maybe mutated and turned into other species of viruses. So does a kind also apply to viruses, not just to other living things? And then, how did measles become a human disease? Or maybe that gives away a little bit of the story. Maybe has it always been a human disease? Or did it originate somewhere else? That's the idea of the zoonotic origin. And then we want to tackle the question of, if it's been around for a while, how did it survive on Noah's Ark? All right, so first we have to think about the measles virus in a kind of a broader context. Not just about measles itself, but the family that it's in, or potentially the kind of virus that it is. Now, the measles virus has been categorized, all right, classified, similar to other living things. We're not going to get into a debate about whether viruses are alive or not, but you can still characterize them in similar fashions as you can living things. And so the measles virus is in a particular genus, the Morbillivirus genus. But that genus, as you can see here, has many other closely related genera. And all these different groups that are shown here are part of a large family of viruses that are all the same type of virus and share similar genomic characteristics, have similar ways of infecting different organisms. They all have a similar genome type, which is that they're single-stranded RNA. I believe they're negative strand RNA viruses. And so viruses have a lot of wild genome architectures, much more diverse than all other living things. But with respect to all of these different viruses, they all have the same type of genome and they operate in a similar fashion. So what about the Morbillivirus? What is the variation there? So let's go to this Wikipedia page and we'll see the different, some various what are called species of viruses here. And so we have Morbillivirus, and the one that we're talking about here is a hominis, all right, as in hominid version or the human version, and that was what we call measles. But there's also a felis version. That's the cat version of the measles. And then we also have a cetacean, all right, that, dolphins and whales get a virus that's very similar to the measles virus in humans. There's also a canine version, which is probably very familiar to many of you because it's a distemper, canine distemper virus. For which there is a vaccine, which most domestic dog owners have given that vaccine to their dog because they don't want their dog to get distemper. It's a rather aggressive virus. And then you have Rinderpest virus, and you'll notice the little symbol next to picorus, Morbillivirus picorus, and that means it's extinct. That thing has been eradicated. It is one of the success stories, at least success story from our perspective, not from the viral perspective, but because that virus doesn't exist anymore. But that is a virus that we as human beings have eradicated from the face of the earth. That infects cows. And the way we eradicated it is by massive amounts of vaccination campaign all around the world to get rid of that particular virus. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different organisms that different kinds of mammals that are infected by species of this particular virus. Each one has its own sort of disease state. They manifest themselves differently in different animals, and the genomes aren't identical. So they are different species. Like the version of measles that infects human beings doesn't infect any other animals. And the dog version of this virus does not affect cats, and the cat version doesn't affect dogs. And that's one of the reasons they're classified as different species, is because they have different life cycles that are dependent on different host types and are adapted to different types of organisms. But yeah, I forgot I had this particular slide. All right. So again, humans, canines, and the globally eradicated picorus. And what's amazing is even dolphins and whales. All right. So this particular virus has found its way into many different kinds of mammals. Now I'm just telling you something just the way I said that, right? I said found a way into. That suggests that each one of these viruses wasn't created separately, all right, as a unique creation just for these particular different mammals, but has started out as some form of virus that then infected one mammal and then had some kind of mutation that allowed it to jump from one animal to another. That's the zoonotic aspect of this. Jumping from one animal to another, infecting a different kind of animal, and then adapting to that particular animal to the point where we would call it a different species of virus. And then potentially jumping some of those individual viruses, jumping to another type of mammal, and then adapting to that particular animal, and then becoming a different species in that one. So for example here, this is just showing a little phylogenetic tree of relationships of Morbillivirus of just one particular species. This is the species that infects dolphins. And then so they have collected samples from dolphins that are infected by this virus, sequence the entire genome of the virus to look at how similar those different viruses are. And so you can see here in the Mediterranean, all these dolphins in the Mediterranean have a very similar version of the virus, which is constantly mutating and changing. But because these branches aren't very long, that means there's not a lot of individual mutations that separate those different viruses. So you can think of as different strains. And then you have Mexico down here, the North Atlantic. There is another Mediterranean one, but that's an older strain. And so that is from longer time period ago, and it has had more mutations since the newer strain. And so this virus is, this image just shows you that this virus is constantly changing. Now, in the case of measles, measles actually doesn't, its genome changes some, but its ability to affect the same animal twice is very, very limited. And you know that because you know that the measles vaccine is very effective, right? You get it as a child and you're good for 50 or plus more years because your immune system will remember that. And the virus, even over 50 years, won't have changed enough to fool your immune system and make you sick again. Right. Unlike the flu, coronavirus, and some other things which have rapidly changing exteriors, which then cause us to have to readapt to that virus over and over and over again. Measles is relatively stable, at least in terms of its surface proteins, and it's that surface protein that is the key. All right, in order to unlock the door to get into its host. So what's really happening in the dolphins here is, yes, the virus is constantly changing with respect to its overall genome sequence, but it's not really able to infect the same animals very well twice. But what's happening is the dolphins are replacing themselves with offspring, right? And those offspring haven't seen the measles virus. So that's how the measles virus, well, sorry, I shouldn't be calling it weasels. The Morbillivirus in dolphins, because it's not actually measles. That's just the name of the disease state in human beings, but we wouldn't call it that in dolphins. But here in dolphins, what happens is that in order to persist, they have to continue, this virus has to continue to find naive individuals. Those would be the next younger generation, and they get passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on and so forth in order to persist as this particular virus. Okay, but again, so before we get to the whole Noah's Ark thing and young Earth creationism, how they would try to explain the origin of viruses and how they could possibly be maintained in populations over time, we still need to think a little bit more broadly about this particular type of virus. So the bigger family that the Morbillivirus is in is called the Paramyxoviridae. And there are many, many different genera in this particular group. But I showed this particular image, which is just a portion of a long list of genome structures. And so the genome of a virus is not a circle. It's not a chromosome, really. It is just a single strand of DNA. In this case, of RNA, ribonucleic acid. And that ribonucleic acid has just 6 genes. It's a very simple genome, right? A very, very simple genome. And these colors are just indicating the different genes. This is the N is for nucleocapsid. That's a really important protein that's on the surface. Actually, in this, what's right behind me here is an image of a measles virus. So the things that are on the surface there, the nucleocapsid proteins. That's the thing that's contacting the surface of the host cell. And so a really important gene. So you see these colors. Now, all I want you to get from this particular image is that these are different forms. Here's the mumps virus. The mumps virus is in the same family as the measles virus. And then down here we have morbilliviruses and narmoviruses. They have this similar genome structure. And then you have all these other different genera, right? So this is a lot of distinct groups causing really widely diverse types of diseases in a variety of lots of different mammals, and sometimes birds and even reptiles. And within humans, not every single one of these infects humans, but there's 4 or 5 of these that infect humans and cause human disease and are endemic in the human population as well. What do you notice about all these different genera and their genomes? Well, they all have the same genes, okay? And they're all in the same order. Now, there are a couple down here that have an extra little piece of genomic information that is lacking in another one. I don't remember what this SH element is, But you'll see that one of these others has it, but they also have TM, all right, whereas this one has TM as well. And you'll see that some of the genomes are a little longer and some are a little shorter. In other words, some of the genes are a little bigger and some are a little smaller, meaning they've lost DNA or they've gained a few base pairs of DNA, which means they've probably gained an amino acid or lost an amino acid, which changes the shape of the protein, giving those proteins slightly different functions. But nonetheless, they have a generic function that's similar in all these different organisms. And so these genomes are very much alike each other, even though they cause completely different kinds of phenotypes, different expressions of disease in their particular host. But you should get the idea that this is the reason why they're all in the same family, right? They're all in the same family because they share a common genomic architecture. And it's not hard to imagine that individual mutations, slight additions, slight deletions, slight insertions, a change of a base pair here and there that changes the protein shape on the surface will cause it to then have a different access point into a different type of cell, or a different access point into a different animal that it couldn't get into before. And this is one of the things that allows them to escape from one host species and through mutation, change their surface proteins and move into another host. And then the types of the way that the disease will manifest itself, or the effects of having that virus essentially will manifest itself in that other host, could be very different than in the previous host, especially if it's entering into a different cell type. So instead of the bronchial passageway, it's entering into the intestinal lining or something like that, right? You're going to have completely different, phenotypes in terms of disease. One other little quick thing about the genome, just to give you a little bit better idea of the genome architecture and how these viruses work. They're very much like bacteria in that bacteria have something called operons, in which they put whole cassettes of like 4 or 5 genes together. And they have one single promoter, meaning like this is where you start and you transcribe and make a copy of the RNA that can be read by the ribosome, the translational unit that makes proteins. And you just sort of read off the entire string all at one time. And so once you start, you just sort of read the whole thing off, and then the ribosome hooks on there and it can read off a protein and then read off the next protein, read off the next protein, read off the next protein. And so that's what this particular virus does too. It doesn't have separate reading frames or start sites in order to transcribe it. It just says like, let's just read this whole string. You read the whole genome in one shot. Now, but as it spins off like pieces of RNA to be read from the negative stance to the positive strand, I don't know, and I don't want to get into all that. There's a couple other steps in here, all right? But as it spins off the RNAs to be read by the host cell, because it's a parasite and it's using the host in order to do its work for it. As it spins it off, since it starts down here at the nucleocapsid protein. It needs a lot of that, all right, because that's like one of the most abundant proteins. And then as it's spinning off this long strand, sometimes the strand doesn't quite get read all the way to the end. And so the last one isn't as important. Well, I guess it's actually important. It just doesn't need to be in as high abundance. And so it's a really amazing sort of design here, right? You have your most important, like I need these the most abundantly. I put them at the beginning of my operon, my set of sequence. And I start making copies, and the copies will always have the first gene, and usually have the second one, and most of the time have the third one. But the last one, I might have got clipped off by the host cell before I got there. So nonetheless, I'm going to end up then with a whole bunch of the first protein, a little less of the second one, and that seems to be that's the right ratio of proteins that when they start to bundle them all together to remake the virus, it makes the Morbillivirus the way the Morbillivirus is. All right, so I did want to say one other little note about Rinderpest, which is the one that's extinct, right? This has been around for several thousand years at least, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years is considered to be the age of Rinderpest. Actually, now I'm trying to remember. I should have my notes up in front of me. Could be a little bit longer than that. But for a long time, this particular virus swept the globe, in basically pandemics, all right, and continually infected new cattle as, you had more offspring and you had you've got a lot of new members of the herd. It would sweep through again and cause a lot of sickness in cattle and a lot of deaths. All right, so this is a really serious problem for thousands of years. Ever since human beings have been herding cattle and bringing cattle close together. In fact, that's probably the origin of this particular virus, is that only when people brought cattle together and kept them close together for long periods of time in fairly large numbers, right, did that offer an opportunity for the virus then to begin to spread among cattle more easily and become more adapted to cattle. But here's the thing. Once they became adapted to cattle, and guess what? People herding cattle are around cattle. Then cattle are sick and they're coughing out, Rinderpest virus, and people are breathing it in, and it's not adapted to human beings. But once in a while, out of the quadrillions times quadrillions times quadrillions times quadrillions of copies, all right, that cows make, because viruses are incredible in terms of numbers. A couple of them have a random mutation that changes the surface protein of this virus and potentially another internal gene as well. And a cow coughs on a human being gets it in its intestinal gets it in, and a human being breathes that in, and it manages to enter into a human cell and propagate itself successfully. And it's probably not really good at it, probably not really successful, like super abundant, but just enough to do okay. And then it starts, because it makes a million and billion copies inside that one human being, makes a few mutations, and very quickly you have selection inside that human being for the ones that work the best and get into the more cells the fastest. In other words, have the right mutations for making themselves more adapted to human cells. Then eventually that individual might get sick and then spew them out on another person and be more likely to have success passing it from one person to another than the cow did to a human being. Right? So that's your zoonotic origin, right? You start with one animal, and then that virus finds a way by mutation to enter into a human being. And once it becomes established in humans, then the virus is different enough that it really can't go back into cows. And its survival depends on going from one human to another. And so they become more and more and more and better adapted to human beings over time. All right, we don't have to worry about the cow version, because the cow version, as I said before, is extinct. It's been globally eradicated through a massive effort. All right, a massive effort by veterinarians and people all across the world in all different countries, either killing off herds that are infected, right? Culling, all right? That's one way to eliminate the virus, so you don't have any individuals that have the virus and are able to spread it. Combined with vaccination, massive vaccination efforts, resulted in the virus eventually not being able to find another host. And the last virus finally died when it could no longer make one cow sick. And since then, there's been no virus to infect cows. And that happened in 2011, and it hasn't been seen since. All right, so it does show that it is possible to eradicate viruses. Right? Measles is a very eradicatable, right, virus. Right? If we simply decided as a human race to eliminate the measles vaccine, it can be done through vaccination. All right, so now with that backstory, right, thinking about the bigger picture of the fact that the measles virus is very similar to many other viruses. And we're quite certain that that virus has not actually existed in the human population since the beginning of the human population. It has existed since people have herded cows, and cows contracted it, and eventually cows gave it to humans. Now, when did that happen? That's considered to be anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 years ago. There's different estimates based on the amount of genetic variation that's found in measles and using the molecular clock to back calculate. And there's also some evidence for the virus in ancient samples going back a couple thousand years. There's some potential evidence of a measles virus in some tissue. That's something that's still being looked for in terms of like the exact origin point of measles. But the measles virus, the genome, the DNA sequence, the RNA sequence in this case of the measles virus is most similar to the cow virus. And then the cow virus is similar to other bat viruses. Right. And then those viruses are similar to canine viruses and feline viruses and, whale viruses and so forth and all the other things that are other mammals. Right. Showing that it looks like this virus started in one place, moved to another animal, and then spread from there to other animals, and other animals spread to other animals. And it's just been branching out. And basically, you can think of it as you can think of it like, well, what was the measles doing in the human population? Is spreading out and, from one person to another and branching out as more people get it. So you can think it's like it's spreading throughout the whole human race. Well, it's not spreading really well because of vaccination and the fact that other people have had measles in the past. And so it's hard for it to find new victims, new hosts, we'll say. But you can think of the overall larger virus, like the viral family. Well, actually, in this case, just the genus, Morbillivirus. You can think of that genus as having an origin point, and then it is spreading not just within a species, but it is spreading from one species to another species to another species. And there are many species across the earth that have never been conquered, by Morbillivirus, but they all stand as possible future victims, right? Because all these other animals that have Morbillivirus are spewing out the virus into the environment. And at some point, some other animal eventually is going to contract that virus, and then it's going to take off in that particular species as well. All right. Oh yeah. Okay. So now we're finally there. We're finally ready to talk about measles on Noah's Ark. All right. Now I've already given you a little hint that measles is maybe only a couple thousand years old. It's not a very old virus with respect to human beings. With respect to Morbillivirus as a genus, tens of thousands, if hundreds of thousands, or possibly longer. And then when you look at the entire family that includes all these other genera, maybe millions and millions of years old. But measles itself as a human disease is very, very young. So now how does that interact with the Noah's Ark thing? So here's how I'm going to illustrate the problem. Let's say that you wanted to say that measles was created as a type of virus from the very beginning in a young Earth creationist framework. Right. And I don't know which day God would have created viruses on, because we don't have those kind of instructions as to on day 5, God created viruses. But if you assume that it was day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, just 6,000 years ago, and he created measles virus, that particular species. Well, measles virus, as far as we know, the only place it can survive is in human cells. It has to be in a human being. Right. So does it mean God created measles virus in Adam and Eve? Was Adam created with a measles virus inside of him, inside of his cells? Because there's no other host outside to give it to him. And then he gave it to Eve, and then they had offspring and they gave it to their offspring. You can already see there's a problem here, because the measles virus, if you have measles virus, your immune system will figure it out and eventually destroy it and wipe it out of your body, right? And give you immunity to it. And so if there's only 2 people around and you give it to the other person and they're sick for a week and then they get better, the measles virus is gone, right? It's been eradicated. Right? There's not enough time to wait around for you to have a child, right? In order to give it to them. And then they would have to grow up and have to have children, right? Within a week, in order to continue the spread. But we'll get to that. There are some, let's say, other explanations that Young Earth creationists might try to employ to get around this problem. Oh, but back to my illustration here. If Adam and Eve had it and then they passed it around and then you ended up with a large community of offspring of Adam and Eve before the Ark, right? Well, really, epidemiologists who study the spread, and the rate of spread and how viruses will continue their existence, right? Do all those types of calculations, but suggest you need to have hundreds of thousands of individuals in order to have enough individuals that you can continue to find new hosts. Because as I said before, measles you get immunity to pretty quickly, and it's pretty good. Once you've had measles and you survive, you're not really going to get measles again. And even if you get it again, you're not going to be a spreader because you're not going to get a bad version of the measles, and you're going to be very unlikely to spread it. So it's going to be very difficult for that virus to continue to exist in a population where everybody's already had measles. So you have to have a large population in order for it to continue to move around and find new hosts. So let's say you had that large population. Well, then of course you get to the flood. And what happens in the flood is you only have 8 individuals. You only have 8 total people. And if one of them, let's say 7 of them had never had it, and one person has an active case of the measles as they walk onto the Ark, and then they give it to their, family, but they're going to be on the boat for a year. They're like, how's the measles virus survive the trip in order to then continue to propagate afterwards? You'd think it would go extinct. In fact, you'd think lots of different diseases should have had extreme extinction events happening at Noah's Ark, whether it's a human virus or one of the many thousands of viruses that infect other vertebrate animals that they would say there was only 2 individuals of on the Ark. Right? That should have been like an amazing clean sweep of like, here's all these different viruses that had become, virulent in the time after Adam and Eve. And then all of a sudden the Ark comes, and that should have been a cleansing moment, right? Instead of a moment in which, destruction of the earth and all the other animals and so forth, and just only start keeping these other ones alive. And it's like for the viruses, it was a cataclysmic event, all right, in which most of them were utterly vanquished. All right, so that's this doesn't seem likely. In other words, from the way that the virus works today, and the way the same virus worked 2,000 years ago, because it seems like it was the same virus 2,000 years ago, and then you have the virus has been found in cattle from 3,000 years ago. The way that this virus looks and acts in its genome, there's no reason to believe that this is a realistic scenario at all. So what to do? What are you going to do? What's the solution to this, what would be a horrific bottleneck to the things that we obviously have present today that are obviously still alive? How did they manage to survive? Right. So here's their 3 basic categories, right? They could have been latent. A latent virus is a virus that maybe gets into a cell and then kind of goes dormant. It doesn't really activate and actively try to propagate itself. And there are viruses that you and I have one. I mean, I got probably herpes simplex 2 virus, which causes cold sores. Right. And it basically infects 95% of the population by the time you're a couple years old. And then you'll have that virus inside of you for the rest of your life. And it often, for most of us, for me, it's definitely latent. It's hibernating, but it's probably a dead virus. It's still in some of my cells, but it's probably unable to activate itself anymore. Let's not go down and talk all about that. I'll just say that there are latent viruses, but you know what? Most viruses aren't latent. I mean, and this virus, like measles, there's nothing about its genome that would allow it to be latent. I mean, it's a piece of RNA, and when it enters the cell, I mean, it's got to propagate itself or it will cease to exist. Right? It just has to. It has to constantly find a new cell, propagate itself, get out of there, get to a new cell, get in that new cell, propagate itself. It is continually finding new things. There's not a hibernation stage. right? As well, I suppose if you froze the tissue, all right, and then warmed it up later and revived the cells, maybe that would be a form of. But that's not what's happening at the flood. So they might say, like, there are viruses like the herpes virus, right? That Noah could have had the herpes virus that he'd gotten when he was 2 years old. He's like 150 years old, and he still has it. And it could have, after the flood, he got stressed out one day, and he had another expression of the herpes virus, and he got a cold sore. And he then then it actually spread amongst his family members, and then it spread to the next babies of the next generation and so forth. And it started spreading, right? So, it's like, okay, well, here we can show an example of how it could have survived. Well, that's an example of one type of virus, but it does not reflect the nature of most viruses. All right. So then you go to option number 2, zoonotic alternative. And this is door number 2 that young Earth creationists are going to take, I'm quite certain, for measles. Most human viruses, they'd say they just didn't exist. Adam and Eve did not have these viruses. They didn't exist as human diseases, right? They're going to say they jumped to humans from other animals, right? So after the human population began to grow, and that's the thing, most small populations if you have a species that only has a couple hundred individuals, it's an extremely rare species. They don't have many viruses, right? They just don't. They're not going to have a Morbillivirus. They're not going to have a coronavirus. They're not going to have, there's all these other viruses. Those viruses depend on large populations. If they enter a small population, they infect everybody. And then, 6 months later, it's like, well, that's the end. We just went extinct because there aren't enough individuals to maintain us. And so, rare species actually have an advantage from this perspective. They don't have a lot of problems with bad viruses, viral diseases. They just don't. Now, there are some generalist viruses out there that can attack a number of different things. And so it's not like they're completely immune to viruses, but they certainly don't have the problems that human beings would have. Once human beings got to a large population size, that's why the origin of most human viruses is fairly recent. Right? Because for a long time, when people lived in small groups and isolated from each other, sure, some tribe, right, in South America got infected by a virus from a bat, right? And it jumped into the human population, and then it infected everybody. And many people might have gotten sick. Some might have died. Some survived. And eventually they all got infected. And then it was like, well, but nobody ever traveled to any other place and spread it to another group of humans. So even though there's humans all around the world, that virus had no way of getting anywhere else. So it went extinct. It was done. Okay. But anyway, the zoonotic, that would mean that Noah didn't have to transport every single virus in his body, all right, from before the flood to after the flood. He didn't have to carry around a coronavirus. He didn't have to carry around all the different flu viruses. He didn't have to carry around the smallpox virus. He didn't have to, it's like, if you go down the list, it's a long list of viruses that infect human beings. And it's like, he wasn't, the young trader said, he wasn't just riddled with viruses, all right, that he's carrying around either as latent viruses or active viruses. No, these viruses invaded human beings later on, hundreds of years later after the flood. And then the other thing they could say is like, well, these viruses because there are viruses that look like they're really old, all right, and have been around for a long time, and every person has them. Well, for one thing, every single one of us that's alive today has lots of viral genomes that are in our genomes, like literally in our genomes, because they've been inserted into our DNA and we've been copying them. And every single one of us has the same viruses in the same position in our genome. That suggests that we were infected by a virus at least far as back as the last time you and I all had a common ancestor, which means they're really old, right? Or for young Earth creationist view, which means they go back to Adam and Eve, right? Because it's shared with every single person on the face of the earth. Every single person alive has hundreds potentially of viral chunks from viruses that infected a human in the past that got into their DNA, and then they passed it to their children, they passed it to their children, passed it to their children, and now we all have it. And that's only possible if we share a common ancestor. I shouldn't say only possible. It's just extremely unlikely. You know, the most parsimonious, the simplest explanation for that observation of our genome is that we all share them because we got it from a common ancestor a long time ago. Now, young Earth creationists might point to, you got insects and you have other environmental reservoirs where animals could have been in eggs or, something that survived the flood. And then that got transported into other animals and then eventually got to humans. All right. So, but that brings us to, let's quickly, because this is going a lot longer than I thought, talk about what do young Earth creationists think that, what are viruses? The viruses are a perennial problem for young Earth creationists because it's sort of like most viruses seem to be bad. You can make cases for viruses do have an effect on the environment, and a necessary effect on some parts of the environment. So therefore you could in some ways consider them good. But the fact is, virtually all viruses have to invade cells. And when they invade the cell and they get out of the cell, they kill the cells, right? They almost always end up killing their host. Now, you may say, well, they could kill the host cells without killing the organism they're in, the whole organism. And so they're not necessarily that bad, but I'm sorry, they're still killing cells and you still have to repair the damage and all that. It's not a good thing. Okay, I forgot. Let's just get through this right here. What are the three main things that all young Earth creationists, dangerous to say all, most young Earth creationists would say about viruses? They would say well, they had to have been good at the beginning. They can't have an evil virus. You can't have a virus that is going around killing animals. Right? Definitely couldn't kill a human being because there wasn't any death before the fall. Now, the caveat there, of course, is that young Earth creationists believe that the bacteria died and that plants could die and that, simple, sponges or something like that could die. We don't have time for the whole discussion of where death can happen and death can't happen, which is essentially a question of what's alive from a biblical standpoint versus not alive. In which case, if it's not technically alive, then it can die. You just don't call it death. You don't call a bacteria dying. It's just ceases to exist in its former composition. But the point is that viruses had to be good. Whatever they were doing, they had to be a positive effect on the environment. They couldn't have been going around killing stuff. And then you got this idea of the created kind. That's where we started at the very beginning. I said that God created all the different sorts of things on the earth as separate creations, not from a common origin. So no young Earth creationist believes that all viruses on the face of the earth all came from a single common origin, like a common ancestor, and became all the different viruses. But they recognize that there are many different species of viruses that are so similar to each other, kind of like Rinderpest virus and the Measles virus, that they probably share a common ancestor in the past. And maybe all Morbillivirus share a common ancestor in the past, in which case they're all one kind. Maybe God created one original Morbillivirus, but he had to have created it as a good one. I don't know where that resided and what animal that was in, because I don't know any animal that goes yeah, Morbillivirus, bring it on. I don't care. It doesn't hurt me at all. No, the virus does damage in every single one of its hosts. Some don't get real sick, right? And they survive fine. But it's still like if you had a choice, you don't go yeah, I want the virus. No, you don't want the virus. Created kinds, and then you had the fall, of course. And this is where they get their idea that, well, they were good. So that genome had a positive purpose. It had some reason to exist in the original creation, those 6 genes in that order. But then when the fall happened, when Adam sinned, then that genome began to decay, or it had mutations, and it turned bad, right? It started to attack things it wasn't supposed to attack. It started to get into, our puppies and give them distemper and cause many of them to die. And that couldn't have happened before the fall. And it causes measles, which is not good for human beings. That couldn't have existed before the fall. But the actual virus that it comes from did exist, except that couldn't have been as bad as it is today. All right, so it goes a little something like this, just to give a little more detail, right? Genesis 1:31, everything was created very good for the world. And they kind of have this idea that there's three different beneficial, they have to find a beneficial function, right? What was this virus doing that had a positive benefit to the world and worked in the original perfect ecosystem? And so they'll point to, well, you know what, viruses, you know what they can do, or at least what scientists say they can do, which I agree they can do, is they can actually transport sometimes, pick up DNA from one host cell, and they can take a little extra bit of the host DNA and transport to another cell that it enters and possibly drop it off there. And that's a way of doing horizontal transfer. And that maybe we know this happens in bacteria. Sometimes viral pieces, sometimes bacterial pieces will get into viral genomes and then get transported to another bacteria. And then if that bacteria survives getting infected by the virus, maybe it breaks the virus up and the virus doesn't have a chance, but it actually captures the DNA and inserts it into its genome. It's a long story as to how that happens. Maybe then you get a DNA from one bacteria to another, and it gives that bacteria a new feature, a new property. It's like, hey, I gained a new gene, from this other different species of bacteria. Because viruses can attack multiple species of bacteria. And so that's horizontal gene transfer, and that kind of helps organisms adapt. We don't have time to go back to my whole discussion about what is adaptation and natural selection in a perfect world before there's any death. But nonetheless, they're trying to say that could have been a positive function. They're couriers. That was their purpose. They were transporting stuff. Sorry, in order to transport, you have to get out of the cell, which means you're probably killing it. All right. So it doesn't, you have to have death, but maybe out of death comes something good. Then you have ecological regulation. I mean, this is what a lot of virus, the ocean is full of countless numbers of viruses. There's more individual viruses in the ocean than there is of all organisms combined, right? Total individuals, organisms of all different kinds of organisms. Right, they're incredibly numerous. And what they do is they're bacteriophages, and they destroy bacteria. They infect bacteria and they break them apart. If that didn't happen, bacteria would continue to multiply, and would use up all the inorganic resources, the nitrogen and phosphorus and all that stuff, right? And all the carbon. And eventually you'd have a giant giant vat of bacteria that would have used all the resource up. And what viruses do is they just constantly kill bacteria, right? I forget what the number is. It's some phenomenal number. I don't want to exaggerate, but it's something like 1/5 or something like that of all bacteria in the ocean die every day. I mean, the numbers are astronomical. But of course, bacteria can also divide hundreds and hundreds of times, in a day. So what happens is the viruses are killing bacteria, which then spill their guts, which then spills all this resource out into the environment, which then other bacteria and other microorganisms can take in order to make new life. And so in a way, you have to have death in order to have more life. And viruses facilitate that, especially with microorganisms, right? Because they are killing a quintillion times a quintillion times a quintillion organisms every single day on the face of the earth. But that's what keeps life constantly growing and making new things. And then there's this other third thing that some young earth creationists will point to, and they'll say hey, that some genes from viruses are really important, endogenous retroviruses will actually insert DNA into animals, and then that could have a positive benefit. I'm sorry, this always astounds me when I hear this actually suggested as a possible positive benefit of viruses, especially when they might mention something like the synectin proteins, which are involved in the placenta, because I mean that's totally an evolutionary story in terms of how viruses actually brought in new genes that allowed new functions in mammals, including the functions of new organ types. I don't know how they would explain how that would work within a young earth creation scenario when all those organisms are already created by God, right? We don't need any more viruses to transfer stuff around and do that. Yeah, I'm sorry. really tempted to talk about that a lot more, but let's not make this too extensive here. So back to viral kinds, right? I think most young Earth creationists accept that there are groups of viruses. Right? You got herpes viruses, like they would say the coronavirus, right? There's SARS-CoV-2, there's SARS-CoV-1, there's SARS-CoV in bats lineages, there's SARS-CoV now in all kinds of other organisms around the Earth. And I think they recognize they all come from a common ancestor at some point. And they would say that common ancestor has to be sometime after, the flood probably. And so they're all part of one family. But of course, what kind of gets me about that is that this is an amazing amount of evolution. Now, I showed you those genomes look pretty similar, but fundamentally, a coronavirus from that infects one kind of mammal and can't infect you is fundamentally different in terms of its biology, right? It's making different proteins that allow it to infect and attach to specific proteins in that particular species. So it's highly adapted. In order for it to move to another species, the zoonotic thing, it has to change itself in order to gain a new function. Right? In order to enter a human being, coronavirus had to gain a new function to be able to enter into our cells, right? Which are different than its original host cells, right? To me, that's adding new information. That's changing the genome and giving a new features to the genome that it didn't have before. And so this whole no new information thing, well, of course, that's really hard to talk about with young Earth creationism because they kind of talk in two different ways depending on what you're talking about, especially when you start talking about viruses. You have somebody like Jerry Bergman, sort of an old school young Earth creationist. He has kind of what I'll call the standard view. The crucial event in generating new strains has not been mutation, but successful reshuffling of pre-existing genes. For him, yeah, you can get new species within a kind, but you're never going to get new genes. You're always just reshuffling parts. You're reshuffling the genes that are there. You have these little pieces of information and you move them around and maybe you get different combinations. And that creates different, sets of variation that are expressed as new species. Right? But Rob Carter recognizes, and many other young creationists, yes, mutations happen. And mutations, they actually do create new information at times. Right? Because they change the function of a particular protein such that it does something different than it did before, giving that organism a new capacity, a new ability. You're not just reshuffling, because reshuffling assumes that you already had the capacity. You're just changing the order of that capacity. Well, you're just saying I had 4 different capacities, right? I have 4 different types of this version of the gene, and I'm going to reshuffle them such that you get type 1 and somebody else gets type 2, and I'm going to add it to this gene has type 1 and this other gene has type 2, and that's a different combination. But I'm not fundamentally adding new alleles, new versions of the gene. But mutations actually add new versions to the gene. They add new variation to a population. And when you look at viruses, it becomes really clear that viruses are constantly changing, and they change to the extent where they infiltrate a new species. And then even when they're in that species, they'll continue to change to the point where they'll infect organisms in different ways and have different outcomes. The disease state changes over time because of the way that's infecting those particular cells. The only way it can do that, change its genes, right? It's not reshuffling. There's no reshuffling 6 genes. I just showed you. I think I have it right here. There's 6 genes across multiple different genera, across hundreds of different species of viruses that all have the same genes. But these infect different cell types, different organisms, and do different things inside those cells. Right? Some are attacking intestines, some are attacking the bronchial passageway, some are more in the nose and they're like colds. Right? They're doing something different. And yet there's no reshuffling. Right? You don't see any reshuffling here, do you? It's the same 6 genes in the same order. They do get longer and shorter. but that's not from reshuffling. That's from mutations. Mutations do create new variation and create new species, new types of organisms. And so the way that Young Earth Creationists will solve the measles problem, not, other viruses, like herpes simplex or, herpes virus or something like that. There's a lot of other viruses that are a lot older. They'd be much more difficult to explain than this. But for measles, it's pretty clear. I think Young Earth Creationists will agree with the evidence that measles is actually the cow virus that has moved into human beings. And so it has an origin point, and the origin point is not from 6,000 years ago. All right. The origin of the actual virus that infects human beings is from cows. So they don't have to go back to Noah's Ark. They say, like, this is post Noah's Ark. And they would say, like, maybe the cows had it. Now, I would say they don't even have to say that. They could say another animal carried it through the ark, then later gave it to cows. And then it mutated in cows and got adapted to cows. And then eventually, because of a large population, it just creates the odds. The chances of spreading it become greater the more individuals are infected. It's true for all these viruses, right? The more that it gets made, the more that gets spewed, the more you increase the chance that it will find the magic combination, all right? By chance, mutating constantly, it'll find the right combo and infect a new, do a zoonotic jump to human beings. And that's where we get our modern measles from. Okay, so this family is extremely vast, numerous, causes dozens of different viral diseases in human beings, each of which have had different origin points, and each of which has been originated from an animal source, so a zoonotic. And yet, if you trace all of those back, they originally go to some common ancestor. So there is some common ancestor to this entire family, the 6 genes in that order, in that form of genome, that has this basic like structure. By the way, I didn't show you all the pictures of these, but they're not all necessarily round with the exact shape, even though they have the same genes. They have changed those genes enough that they have changed the actual morphology, right? External appearance for the virus. But the point here is that if you trace the family back, there's a common origin. That common origin then resulted in multiple different species, maybe one type of virus that infected multiple different kinds of animals, which then each became different species. And then they then had mutations, which then went out and infected other species. And then they had mutations such that they changed the genome so much that they became basically a different type. They became mumps, all right? Right? A different genus. And then that genus then spread back into human beings, right? Got reinfected into human beings from some other animal and took on a new, what we would call disease. That's why we have, multiple different diseases in human beings caused by viruses from this particular family. But they really have a common origin. Now that ups the ante though for Young Earth Creationists. Because wait a second, if they all started as a common origin after the flood, and then they had to spread, and then they had to enter into humans as one disease, but then they had to also go out to many different animals and continue to change and become different genera. And then after they become different genera, then reinfect humans at a later point, you're going to run into a time problem. It's going to take a long time and a lot of mutations in order to become this many different kinds of things. The other kind of scary thing, and the thing that you all need to think about in terms of the future, is that these viruses, in order to persist, again, they have to constantly adapt. And so you can think of each one of these different species as something that's constantly going out and looking for new hosts. Not just hosts in the same species, but if they could find a mutation and get out of that host and get into deer or some other animal that has a large population, then that's like a whole new, whole new landscape. None of these have been infected before. And that's where you get these pandemics from, not just human pandemics, but animal pandemics, right? You get all of a sudden animals all around the world of this particular type are suffering. That's because they're experiencing a new zoonotic effect, introduction. And then that virus spreads, adapts. And then it has more opportunities to spread to other animals because now it has more virus out there. And so the family is just growing and growing and growing. And that's the thing about the coronavirus family. It's a pretty young family, young like tens of thousands of years versus hundreds of millions of years. I mean, these things are not necessarily that old. And coronavirus has spread into so many different animals that its pace of expanding it's expanding, it's conquering lots and lots and lots of the animal kingdom. And so that's why the future, holds a lot more pandemics, right? Not just for humans, but for all other animals, because there is that particular virus has been very successful and is finding new ways into spreading. So you're just seeing the origin of species, the origin of genera, the origin of a whole family, just expanding and conquering different groups along the way. So young Earth creationists kind of have to deal with this. Like, what do you want? Do you want no new information? You're just reshuffling. That doesn't seem to work. But at the same time, you have to admit there's rapid adaptation. You only have 6 genes, right? You can't just do that reshuffling, right? If you only have 6 genes and those 6 genes have 6 primary functions, right? And you can wiggle around with each one of those primary functions and tweak them with mutations. Some of those mutations have to be really, really important and fundamentally change like the nature of what that particular virus can do. And since all these viruses have come from a common origin, like in the Morbillivirus, you're going to have massive, rapid variation occur, rapid adaptation happening in a young Earth creationist worldview. And that's going to require a lot of mutations, right? And which is, to me, is new information. All right. So you can't have no new information and have rapid adaptation. You're going to have the two together. All right. So what's a kind of virus? It's really fuzzy where the edge of a kind of virus is. Is it the genus? Is it the family? We could have gone bigger. Like if you go beyond the Paramyxoviridae, there are other families of viruses that also have very similar genomic architectures, the same types of genes, slightly different orders. Some of them have an extra gene or two. And you could say, well, but they all share a common ancestor. So maybe the family's even bigger. But the bigger you make the family, then the more adaptation, the more mutations are going to be required over a very short period of time in order to explain them within a young Earth creationist framework. Could God have created every single one of these viruses separately for each different species? If you want to go that direction, then you got to get them all through the Ark, right? You got to squeeze them through that bottleneck, right? Because they would have been there from the beginning if they don't share a common ancestor with each other. So I don't think, I think most, like I said, most young Earth creationists aren't going to put measles on the Ark. And I would agree with them that it's really not necessary. Even the secular science agrees that the measles isn't even that old. It's not even 4,000 years old. It's an amazing thing to think about. A lot of common viruses in human populations today are actually quite young. All right, so I think that's it. I think that answers a bit of the question that was raised in the comments section about how measles survived the Ark. And maybe we learned a little bit about measles along the way. It's still out there. It's definitely spreading. By the way, I haven't heard of any like definitive cases that resulted from that individual that was at the Ark Encounter several weeks ago. There are a couple cases right here, just here in North Ohio, that are in a family that because of privacy issues, they don't really say like where somebody traveled, but it does sound very much like they could have been in Kentucky. But we don't know of any, like, did the Ark Encounter event actually result in something of a breakout? It kind of doesn't matter because there's over 500 cases in South Carolina now over the last month and a half. Bunch in North Carolina now. In the last 3 weeks, there's been cases reported in 15 different states. So right now, measles is running at its highest amount of spread that we have seen in this country in more than several decades. We are going to surpass last year's numbers, maybe by the end of February. And so it's establishing itself once again in the North American population. There's a lot of cases in northern Mexico, and Canada had twice as many cases as we had in this past year. And considering how Rinderpest has been completely rendered mute, it's kind of sad that measles is making a comeback. Measles kills 10,000 to 100,000 people a year around the world. Most of those in Africa and other third world countries. So that is the reality is that it could become far, far worse if we don't continue to be diligent. All right, get off my soapbox now and say thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.